Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is 7th of March, and we're going to begin by looking at the Kursk region because there are some really important Russian advances that hit at the center of the Ukrainian grouping that remains in the roughly 350 square kilometers of territory they control within the Kursk region. We're going to look at the way in which Ukrainian logistics are affected by these recent Russian advances, along with an entrance into Sumy Oblast from another location. Then moving southwards, we're going to discuss another Russian advance along the Oskila bridgehead. Then southwards, we'll look at Touretsk, where there's a lot of movement in Chasiv Yar. We'll finish off with developments near Rozliv. But as I said, I want to begin with Kursk, as I view this as the most critical part of the front line right now. A lot of the highest intensity fighting is occurring over here, so it's only natural for me to discuss it first. As we do so, please like and subscribe so you can revive the channel. Beginning with the western side of the fronts, you can see over here in yellow, I have this polygon indicating Russian advances that include a full capture of the border between, you could say here, Kursk and Sumy in this particular strip of territory, and it amounts to nearly 6 square kilometers in total. It also includes Russian forces crossing over the border, over the anti-tank ditch, and entering into the open fields on the Sumy side of the border. So you can see, based on this geolocation from March 7th, that border guards from the Ukrainian side, they utilized mortars to hit 3 Russian soldiers that entered into Sumy. And as a result, we now know that the Russians are at a minimum a distance of 1.7 kilometers away from Basivka, and that is their eventual goal. When you look at the elevation around here, it begins to make sense where the Russians are choosing to advance through. So, for instance, this is on a lower lying valley, this is Churovka region, and it's an area that the Ukrainians have been able to stabilize and prevent Russian infiltrations deeper into their territory. An area that's on higher elevation is actually where we're seeing the Russian advances right now, and it's sandwiched in between the two chains of villages, one being Juravka and then one being around Novenke, because you can see over here that the ridge sort of extends all the way from Basivka to Loknaya and then to Yakivka, which is a really important intermediary point between the rear of Sumy city itself and then the Ukrainian positions in Sujo. Then a bit to the east, you also have another higher elevated region that is pretty close to the border, but then extends into Ukrainian territory as well. And you could see that I'm squiggling over it in red for you guys. So that's an area that also crosses over the R200 highway that is still under Ukrainian control, but is increasingly coming under pressure from Russian drones as the front line gets closer and closer to the highway. And right now, at its closest, the Russians, and let's measure this right now, you could see they're about 5.6 kilometers away. So that is within the distance of really all the FPV drones, even the fiber optic FPV drones. So they're beginning to just rain hell upon the entire highway against any sort of convoy rotation that is spotted throughout the entire day, 24/7. So that's causing a strain on Ukrainian movements, and it's leading to a situation where in Ukrainian wounded soldiers, they have to wait several days before there could be a safe route established. And so then that eventually leads to their condition worsening, or they could be killed as a result of not getting that sort of immediate treatment. So that's been reported by the Ukrainian side and the soldiers that are operating on the Kursk fronts. But just as a reminder, the advances over here by the Russian side, they're aimed at reaching Basivka, and from there they would be able to establish physical control all the way to the R200 highway, because after Basivka there are no other defensive obstacles that the Ukrainians would have to prevent the Russians from actually physically reaching this road. And not just that, but it would also allow the Russians to penetrate the entire Ukrainian rear of the Kursk front and then eventually connect with the other Russian outstretched territory and salient that we've seen developing over the past few days, all with the objective of cutting off Suja, not necessarily fully cutting it off, but creating a situation wherein the Ukrainians are sort of squeezed out and forced to withdraw under pressure from 3 directions in an envelopment. So that's sort of the threat that is looming. And what this means is that the Ukrainians have to divert resources to defending their flank on this western side instead of defending within Kursk itself. And that, of course, leads to attention being drawn elsewhere, and it gives Russia's opportunity to advance directly through Kursk at a faster pace. And we're seeing them now increase the intensity of the assaults once again directly along the spine of Kursk, as I refer to it, because you have the spine of Ukrainian villages that they have under their control, which span from Pogrebki all the way to Nikolsky. Now, many of those villages have fallen into Russian hands as a result of just month over month of Ukrainian attrition, and due to the finitude of Ukrainian holdings, it was eventually going to occur. Really, we're talking about a very small surface area and a lot of villages compacted into a single region. So, understandably, once one village was taken over, the Russians had an outlet to immediately advance southwards. So, that's what we're seeing around here. After the capture of Pogrebki, it sort of opened up the gates and allowed the Russians to advance southwards along a singular paved road, capture Marivka, Orlovka, also Novaya Sorochino. Based on this recent geolocation, from March 7th, we know the 22nd Special Purpose Brigade also raised their flag in Staraya Sorochino. So that is another settlement now coming under Russian control, and it's an indication of 1.85 square kilometers of territory captured. Naturally, the next route and the next village that will be within the Russian purview is Nikolaevka, and there is this sort of outstretched Ukrainian position which may or may not be under their control right now, and that is located a bit to the west. So if there are Ukrainian remnants over here, they're going to be squeezed out very quickly. And then the focus will entirely fall to Malaya Loknaya, which has been pounded heavily by the Russian side in recent days, including with FAB 1,500 bombs and using UMBKs, of course, and with FAB 250s. There's actually a video over here from March 6th of a FAB 3000 strike, which we don't see very much of, on a windbreak north of Molai Loknaya, because there were also Ukrainian organization points on the eastern rear of the spine of villages, or at least whatever remains under Ukrainian control. When it comes to elevation in this region, just off the top of my head, it looks something like this, wherein the ravines, the vast like tree lines and open areas that are located west of these populated regions, they tend to be on high elevation, but then around like I believe Viktorovka or bits to the west of it, that's when the ridge sort of dies down. But all of this region is on pretty high elevation that I'm squiggling over. Then the actual villages, of course, naturally they're going to be on lower elevation. So that runs along this entire line that you see in red. And then directly to the east, you also have some pretty high elevation in the areas that are close to the rail line. There's another depression point a bit to the east, and then you have another long line of a ridge that is under split Russian and Ukrainian control right now. So the Ukrainians do have some heights under their control in open areas east of these villages, which sort of levels the playing field and ensures there is some fire support for the Ukrainians on their sort of eastern rear. But in comparison to the fact that they have to defend and physically fight within a lower lying valley against Russian forces fighting and firing towards them from the west, it's not enough to compensate, and it does lead to compounding issues over time. And right now, Malaloknaya, which serves as one of the largest villages under Ukrainian control in this entire region, is about to become contested. So we're going to cover that and really keep an eye out for Russian entrances in the near future. We all know that the garrison over here consists of some of Ukraine's higher quality units, and there's no indication that they're planning to withdraw right now. In fact, they're actually moving in additional reinforcements, and that's a part of protecting the flanks, I believe. It's not necessarily a vanguard maneuver to ensure that troops can withdraw safely, not yet at least. So for the time being, you still have the 47th and a whole host of other experienced units that could have been served elsewhere, but they're continuing to serve and hold on to this part of the front line and trying to build up a cohesive front line. And you could see that, for instance, the 4th Special Ranger Regiment is involved in defensive activities around Nikolsky. And as a result, they've been able to prevent the Russians from physically encircling Malaya Loknaya from the south. So you had this incident over here. It wasn't from March 7th. It was actually from 2 weeks ago. But the video is released today where they cleared out a Russian advance using a BMP-2. They fired towards the Russian positions in this sort of tree line region and on the nearby hedgerows. They also pushed the Russians out of the houses in Nikolsky itself. And as a result, the front line is sort of stabilized over here. And you haven't seen the Russians take advantage of the very narrow positions in Nikolsky and the nearby sort of tree line hedgerow region, because in reality, it really is narrow. It's an area that could be easily exploited if there is enough wherewithal needed for it. And then you could see a Russian penetration that would lead to the sort of cutting off, not entirely, but of the southern route that reaches Milailoknaya, not just through this 1 kilometer strip, but actually expanding 2 kilometers eastwards and then cutting off this other paved road that leads to frontline Ukrainian positions. So that's something the Ukrainians understand, and that's why they've been trying to plug some holes in those locations. There's also been a strike recently recorded by the Bars 22 Battalion and by the 155th Marine Brigade. Pretty heavy bombardment of Loknaya, which is still under the control of Ukrainians, and it currently acts as a dividing line, this entire Loknaya River and sort of wider body of water, but it's something that is completely temporary as the Russians are currently in the process of just solidifying control over the large quantity of open fields they've taken over past Verdlikovo and in Lepidivka. And so eventually the attention will turn back to Luknaya, which is on low elevation. It's an area that does not consist of many fortifications besides this one anti-tank ditch, and it's a very small settlement surrounded by open fields and forested regions. So it's an area that is really prone to future Russian attacks. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. But as we move southwards, this is the most interesting development over the past few days, and this involves Russian forces advancing west of Kirillovka. And this is a direct result of the failures of the Ukrainian counterattack that occurred at the sort of like, what was it, like early February period moving into mid February. And the maximalist goals would be to reach Ulyanok from a Ukrainian perspective and then just entirely cut off any sort of Russian presence north or west of the Psel River. Due to that failure, the Russians were able to eventually strengthen their positions, refortify over here, and then expand themselves westwards into locations previously not even covered and considered to be within the Overton window advances for either side. So recently, due to the intense drone bombardment of the R200 highway, which you see marked in yellow, the Ukrainians have shifted towards a secondary route that is a bit further away from the front line, at least from the north. From the east, it's not far away. But the understanding was that the Russians weren't putting as much resources and firepower into this eastern front. Now that's changing. And you could see in black, I've marked this route that I suppose begins from Mohoritsia over here and then extends northwards all the way into Goncharovka and Sujo. It runs along some local paths and then near an adjacent rail line. So it is an important logistics route the Ukrainians have been using over the past couple of weeks. And now you can see that it has almost been physically cut off, meaning that any movement over here by Ukrainian forces theoretically is possible, but in actuality would be extremely dangerous. So you can see the Russian forces over the past 2 days have captured a combined total of 5.4 square kilometers of territory. And it's more so about the width, not about the surface area covered. Could see that the Russians advanced at a maximum of 5.3 kilometers, which is a significant amount, largely occurring through this open region west of the Psel River and then reaching some of the houses in southern Kirillovka, then entering into this dense forestry and also into some of the nearby warehouses. As a result, the Russians right now, if we're going to measure it, they are about 800, 900 meters away from the road itself. This is really going to add even further strain onto Ukrainian logistics. And so you can imagine that now they have no choice but to use the R200 highway, which has already been exposed to so much damage as a result of earlier attacks. And there are dozens of Ukrainian vehicles littered along over here that are destroyed or damaged, disabled, that can't even be retrieved because it would be too dangerous to stay there in a single region for too long. Now that the weather is getting better in this region, you're also going to begin to see more muddy conditions after the winter season. And you're also seeing the fact that there's sometimes an issue where vehicles they can't drive faster than, for instance, 20 kilometers an hour because of the poor road quality and due to some visibility conditions as well. There's a lot of foggy, low-lying clouds that cause issues for the Ukrainian side and for the Russian side alike. But you're just seeing a complete breakdown in logistics, which I believe is similar to what we saw during the Bakhmut period, where the Russians really did exploit the flanks of the Ukrainian entrance into the pocket more generally. And now we're seeing it at an even larger scale and also with a similar caliber of units in terms of size and also quality. So, all in all, the Russian advance over here is important for additional regions because south of Suja, you have just this large collection assortment of forests. They're largely on high elevation. There are a couple of paths passing through it that are on low elevation, but generally, it's one of the dominating ridges that actually even overlooks some Ukrainian positions and some of their forests that are deeper into Sumy. But also, it's important because it overlooks Ukrainian holdings that are within Kursk on the border, like Gornal and Guevo. Guevo specifically is Ukrainian organization points, and now it's cut off from the majority of Ukrainian positions that are a bit to the west. I mean, they could still be accessed, but it takes a longer route of just circling around in a crest formation, which is not as efficient as previously when it could have just been accessed by advancing over here north to the northwest. So Guevo has sort of been isolated from the larger Ukrainian positions in Kursk, and it's more so now just an extension of Ukrainian positions that are running along the Psel River to the south in this portion of Sumy, which is a difficult region because there aren't that many paved roads. It's an area just littered with forests and swamps and open fields as well. So it's a geographic nightmare when it comes to logistics, and it is, I suppose, now more so connected to the Sumy region, and there are Ukrainian organizational points that were struck by the Russian Air Force over the past couple of days. And the Russians also claimed they were able to capture two POWs during the advance. And so Guevo will become now a Russian target as the Russians continue to solidify control west of the Psel River, and then also allow the Russians to begin pushing onto the sort of western flank of Suja if they are able to advance northwards, and really cause a lot of issues for the Ukrainian garrison that remains in that city. So we're going to cover this all in even more detail in future videos. We're going to look at a troop breakdown. We're going to look at the order of battle for both sides and even deeper analysis of the elevation. But for now, I want to look at the Kharkiv region. Over here, the Russian forces, just with a marginal advance, were able to take over 2.1 square kilometers north of Novomlinsk and just generally along the western bank of the river, which is now falling into Russian hands across a broader piece of territory and could eventually connect with the Topoli region where you have a smaller Russian bridgehead. The pace of Russian advances over here has decreased following Ukrainian stabilization measures, in part due to the movement of the 151st Mechanized Brigade to this part of the front line. It was previously serving on the Dnipro axis, so just to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which is a really important part of the front line, but has died down in recent weeks. And so now the Ukrainians had the opportunity to move this unit to defend over here around the region as well, and was involved in a localized counterattack that pushed the Russians out of some positions north of Zapadne, including this larger forested region. So that amounts to 4 square kilometers of territory captured in recent days. And we'll have to see if moving in one brigade will be enough in the long term, or whether this is just a part of a Russian operational pause after some large scale advances west of the river, and that eventually they'll restart those advances in areas where they are most suitable geographically, and potentially in areas where there are holes in the Ukrainian line. For instance, in the area the Russians are currently advancing through, because the 151st Brigade is more so committed to the region west of the Vrichna, in order to prevent the Russians from using the Vrichna as a sort of linchpin to advance deeper into the Ukrainian rear. Now, when we look at further advances over here in Bielorussia, for instance, we know the Russians have been able to advance even further west of the town, and this was based on geolocations of motorcycles pushing through those regions and soldiers on foot advancing here. So it amounts to a gain of zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory, and the Russians have basically reached the Donetsk-Luhansk border in this location, indicating that now you have this grouping of Russian forces that could squeeze out the Ukrainian remnants from this area further south. And then the new focus will be on capturing these heights that are located to the northeast of Seversk. That will give the Russians the long term projection and opportunity to overlook the entire Ukrainian garrison to the west. But again, we're looking at a pretty slow pace of advances, so don't expect anything to happen in the near future. Now, looking over here at Chasiv Yar, we do have an interesting Russian armored assault, because we saw last year during the capture of this eastern parts of Chasiv Yar that there was a large reliance on armored vehicles. And even recently, during the assault in the center of Chasiv Yar, there were a couple of incidents where armored columns were utilized. But there is an issue, because they have to cross over a large swath of open fields from Bakhmut to reach the Donbass Canal and reach Chasiv Yar. And they actually need to reach even deeper into Chasiv Yar, because now the front line has shifted so much further to the west. And so there were so many opportunities for Ukrainian drone crews to target those vehicles, and it's extremely dangerous, especially when crossing over the canal. So usually, uh, you know, advances on foot are preferred by the 98th VDV division, and a lot of infantry have recently been built up and moved discreetly from the western, or I suppose eastern bank of the canal to the western side, and are now hiding in various underground systems and largely basements. And after a certain point when they were accumulated in this northern part of Chasiv Yar, they were involved in that armored attack that tried to advance all the way southwards and cut off physically the center of Chasiv Yar over here. by attacking the western flank and reaching Mykolaiv. That was the objective, but they were stopped halfway from Mykolaiv, the Russian forces. So they advanced a total of 700 meters, but they still need to advance another 800 meters, you could say, before reaching that suburb of Chasiv Yar. So on March 6th, you had the 24th Brigade destroying 11 vehicles, and this is on camera, and they also damaged five, and that was out of, I believe, 26 vehicles. And so for now, the Ukrainian garrison over here has been able to retain control of most prized possessions. But long term, it's not sustainable to have a situation where in the core of Ukrainian resistance, which is within this citadel region and also in the industrial areas, is almost in envelopment from three sides. It makes it really difficult for forces to move in, and the forces that do come in, they have to go through this really complex labyrinth of trees and unpaved routes, and so the logistics over here are also complicated for the Ukrainian garrison. Now, when we move southwards, you'll see in the Turetsk region, for instance, there is a couple of changes that we have to look at, and these are just positional advances by the Russian side after the Ukrainians sort of got stretched out and were not able to retain control over their maximalist gains. So over here in the industrial zone of Tresk, you can see a slight Russian advance based on the 1st Battalion and the 42nd Brigade conducting FPV strikes on Russian positions in the Centralna mine. And so now the Russians have been able to reinsert themselves in this really important fortified region. So for the most part, the Ukrainians were not located in any industrial areas. They're near the rail yard and some of the smaller warehouses, but they are largely just controlling the route into the rail yard and into the industrial zone through a lot of these houses. And we don't know how strong that control really is because of how narrow the route it actually is. And so for the Russian side, what they need to do is just send in a large quantity of reinforcements, and the situation would eventually just sort itself out at that point because the Ukrainians would have no ability to actually exert, any sort of deep control over their penetration over here unless they committed additional forces in such a manner that we've seen around the Zabalka district or near Krimske, because those are areas where the Russian advances are also occurring, and we are seeing a bit of a back and forth over here. So we know about the pretty deep advance by the Ukrainian side south of the Krimska mine, which amounted to a gain of basically 1 kilometer deep into the city of Turets. But now we're seeing the Russians undermining it from the west. And this has allowed them to capture some of the houses over here. And this is based on the geolocation from March 7th of the Voron units of the 100th Mechanized Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto these same houses. So this is a pretty big deal. And it's a part of the reason why it's difficult for the Ukrainians to permanently reassert control over Turets, because even if they are able to conduct really successful penetrations in specific regions, the flanks are never actually cut off based on the scale of the Ukrainian advances. So then you still have Russian groupings that maybe aren't fully cohesive, but they're able to eventually stabilize the situation and then pick off and undermine the Ukrainian positions that are even more narrow and even more exposed. And so that's what we're seeing in this case. And it means that the long term, I suppose, longevity for the Ukrainian garrison that advanced south of Krimska is extremely compromised. And we also know, based on recent geolocations, that this large gray zone that I previously had marked south of Krimska is actually under Russian control. So the situation isn't as favorable for the Ukrainian side in Tursk as it was when they initially launched these offensive activities on February 23rd. We also know, in regards to the southernmost portion of Zabalka, the Russian forces have been able to retake a certain chunk of the houses. And this is also based on videos from the Faron unit conducting FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers that were advancing over here. But these are still gains that are positional in nature. Now, the final advance that I want to look at today, and we're going to zoom in on the Roslev region. You could see that over here on the map. So this is from 4 square kilometers of territory captured in total by the Russian side. You can see the geolocation from March 6th, Ukrainians shelling armored vehicles from the Russian side that were advancing. And in total, we're able to capture territory amounting to 2.5 kilometers northwards. And this is important because although the positions over here are largely open, there are a couple of anti-tank ditches that are being overrun by the Russian vehicles. This could present a new threat for the Ukrainian side as they try to finally have a modicum of stability around Bakhatir, Oleksivka, and Roslev, Although frontally they've been able to prevent any deeper Russian advances, there's a possibility that their southern flank is not properly vetted and not properly defended, and that the Russians could eventually have some sort of gap exposed and attack all the way to Roslev or all the way to Bakhatir, and in the process also take control over higher elevated regions that are overlooking those villages to the south. So that is a possibility that has to be addressed from a Ukrainian perspective. And that's all for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.